a Viking longship could cross an ocean, but it could not keep out the cold. Picture an open wooden hull cutting through the North Atlantic as icy spray climbs over the side and a hard wind presses wet cloth against every sailor on board. There is no heated cabin waiting below, no waterproof jacket, and no button that turns the temperature up. Yet Norse crews sailed between Scandinavia, Britain, Ireland, Iceland, and eventually Greenland, often spending long hours exposed to weather that could become dangerous without warning. So how did they stay warm enough to keep rowing, steering, and surviving? The honest answer is less glamorous than the legends. They layered the best materials they had, controlled moisture and wind as well as they could, shared a very crowded working space, and planned their voyages around opportunities for shelter. They were not comfortably warm. They were managing cold, minute by minute. The first thing to understand is that a longship was designed for speed, flexibility, and shallow water, not for comfort. Its clinker-built oak planks overlapped to create a light, strong hull that could flex in rough seas, and its shallow draft allowed the crew to approach beaches and rivers that deeper ships could not reach. Those advantages came with a brutal trade-off. The working area was largely open, the sides were low enough for oars, and everyone lived close to rain, wind, spray, and water collecting inside the hull. A longship was closer to a fast wooden transport than a floating house. Or, to put it less politely, it was an excellent vehicle with absolutely terrible heating. The deck did not protect a sailor from cold air, and the sea beneath the planks pulled heat away from anyone sitting still. Even in summer, a North Atlantic crossing could feel raw, especially at night or after clothing became soaked. Cold at sea attacks the body in several ways at once. Moving air strips away the thin layer of warmth near the skin, wet fabric transfers heat faster than dry fabric, and evaporation cools the body further whenever wind passes over damp clothing. A sailor who stopped working could begin shivering quickly, while numb fingers made ropes, oars, and steering equipment harder to control. If cooling continued, confusion and poor coordination could become as dangerous as the temperature itself. On a crowded vessel in rough water, one slow decision could threaten more than one person. The Vikings did not know the modern medical term hypothermia, but they certainly understood its warning signs through experience. They knew that a wet, exhausted person needed protection, food when available, and a chance to recover before strength disappeared. This was not a test of toughness. The cold does not care how impressive your beard looks. Their most important defense began long before the ship left shore: wool. Archaeological finds and textile evidence show that ordinary Viking-age clothing commonly relied on locally produced wool and flax, while wealthier people could add imported fabrics, decorative cloth, or fur. A typical male outfit included a tunic and trousers, with additional layers chosen according to weather, work, and status. For a sailor, wool was valuable because its crimped fibers trapped many small pockets of air, slowing the movement of heat away from the body. It could absorb a surprising amount of moisture while still offering insulation, although soaked wool became heavy and was never magically dry. The fleece of older northern sheep also contained natural lanolin and included both softer underwool and coarser outer fibers. That combination helped the living sheep survive harsh weather, and processed wool remained useful in cold, damp conditions. It may not have smelled like a luxury store, but survival has never been especially interested in fragrance. One wool garment was useful. Several were much better. A sailor could wear a linen or wool layer close to the body, then a wool tunic, trousers, and an outer cloak or heavier garment. The exact outfit varied, and no complete standardized Viking naval uniform has survived for us to inspect. That uncertainty matters because modern illustrations often dress every Viking as if the same costume had been issued across 3 centuries and thousands of kilometers. Real clothing differed by region, wealth, season, available materials, and personal repair work. Layering still follows a simple principle. Several trapped air spaces usually protect better than one exposed layer, and individual pieces can be removed during hard rowing or added when a sailor stops moving. Caps, hoods, wraps, mittens, and warm footwear would protect areas that lose function quickly in wind, though the evidence for exact shipboard combinations is incomplete. The goal was not fashion consistency. It was keeping hands useful and the core warm. An outer wool cloak could perform several jobs at once. Pinned around the shoulders, it blocked some wind, shed part of a light rain, and created another insulating space over the tunic. When work ended, the same cloak could become a blanket, a cushion, or a screen against spray. Fur and sheepskin could add protection for people who had access to them, and leather or treated skins may have helped resist wind and water. But we should not turn this into a claim that every sailor wore a perfectly waterproof fur suit. Animal skins were heavy, expensive in labor, and uncomfortable when saturated, while many organic materials have not survived in a form that reveals exactly how they were used at sea. The safest conclusion is that Norse sailors combined wool, cloth, hides, and constant adjustment rather than relying on one miracle garment. Their wardrobe was a system, not a superhero costume. Moisture was the enemy they could reduce but rarely eliminate. Water entered from rain, breaking waves, wet ropes, dripping sails, and the boots and clothing of dozens of people moving through the same narrow space. Crew members had to bail the hull and keep essential gear away from standing water whenever possible. Spare clothing, blankets, food, and other supplies could be wrapped, bundled, raised, or placed where the crew expected less spray, but a violent sea could defeat the neatest arrangement. Once a layer became wet, changing it only helped if a dry replacement still existed. Experimental sailors on reconstructed Viking ships report that drenched wool may take a day or more to dry and can remain heavy even while it continues to insulate. That makes protecting the final dry layer extremely important. On an open ship, a dry pair of socks was not a small luxury. It was treasure with toes. Wind protection could matter as much as adding another layer. The sail, shields, cargo, cloaks, and bodies of other crew members could create small pockets of relative shelter, depending on the ship's direction and the weather. Historical poetry also refers to tents associated with ships, and researchers at the Viking Ship Museum have argued that some form of shipboard tent may sometimes have been raised, possibly even while sailing. We do not know one universal design, and a large cover could interfere with sailing, visibility, or urgent movement in bad conditions. Still, a temporary awning or tent at the right moment could reduce rain and wind enough to make rest possible. When the ship stopped, crews could also go ashore, turn the sail or other material into shelter, light a controlled fire on land, and dry equipment more safely. The warmest place on many voyages may therefore have been beside the ship, not inside it. A longship got them across the water. The coastline gave them a bedroom. Resting on board was uncomfortable and strategically necessary. The Viking Ship Museum's Sea Stallion reconstruction uses alternating watches, so part of the crew works while the others rest, reflecting how a large sailing crew can keep a vessel operating day and night. On that experimental ship, off-duty sailors sleep between the thwarts, on deck boards, or across stored oars, wrapped in woolen blankets rather than trapped inside sleeping bags during travel. That last choice is modern safety practice, but the experiment demonstrates the physical problem Viking crews faced. Almost no private space and no warm cabin. A blanket reduced exposure, and a cloak or spare cloth beneath the body slowed heat loss into wet wood. Crew members could lie close together, although we should be careful not to present deliberate group huddling as a documented rule for every Viking voyage. From a distance, they were terrifying raiders. At 2 a.m, they may have looked more like exhausted wool parcels. The joke ends there, because poor sleep steadily reduced strength, judgment, and morale. Movement produced another source of heat. Rowing a longship demanded sustained work from the back, legs, shoulders, and arms, while handling the sail, hauling ropes, steering and bailing kept other crew members active. During hard labor, too many layers could cause sweat, which later became dangerous when work stopped and cold wind hit damp clothing. Experienced sailors therefore had to adjust garments before they became soaked from the inside. The challenge was a cycle. Work hard enough to stay warm, avoid sweating too heavily, cover up before resting, and begin again when the next watch started. Warmth was not something they achieved once and stored for the voyage. It was continuously produced, protected, lost, and rebuilt. The person rowing might envy the person resting, right until the oar stopped and the shivering began. Food supplied the energy behind that cycle. Sailors needed dense, durable provisions that could survive without refrigeration, including combinations of dried or preserved meat and fish, grain products, dairy foods, and whatever fresh supplies were available along the route. The exact menu changed by region and voyage, and evidence does not support one universal Viking ration list. Cooking on a crowded wooden warship introduced obvious danger, especially in rough weather, so hot meals could be easier and safer when the crew reached land or calm conditions. Even cold food mattered because the body could not generate heat through work without enough energy. Water was equally important, since dehydration weakens physical performance, even when the surrounding sea makes thirst seem impossible. Alcohol is often exaggerated in popular Viking stories, but drinking heavily on a cold, unstable ship would reduce judgment and increase risk rather than create useful warmth. A heroic feast belongs in the hall. On night watch, clear thinking is the better survival tool. The crew itself was part of the heating strategy, not because dozens of bodies turned the ship into a sauna, but because cooperation prevented small problems from becoming fatal ones. Someone had to notice a shivering sailor, take over a task, secure loose gear, bail water, distribute a blanket, or help change a wet layer. Orders had to travel from the steering position to the bow, and everyone needed to react together when the sail or course changed. A disciplined watch system gave people short periods to eat and recover while the vessel continued moving. Crowding was miserable, yet it kept assistants close and reduced the amount of exposed deck available to wind. There was also social warmth in conversation, storytelling, singing, and shared expectations, although those things could not replace clothing or calories. Morale mattered because a frightened, exhausted crew made worse decisions. No single Viking defeated the North Atlantic. The crew survived it together. Good voyage planning reduced the amount of cold the crew had to endure. Norse sailors crossed open water, but they also followed coasts, used islands and familiar landfalls, waited for workable winds, and stopped when conditions or supplies demanded it. They did not possess modern forecasts, yet experienced seafarers could read cloud, swell, wind direction, animal behavior, and seasonal patterns. A captain who left at the wrong moment could turn an ordinary passage into days of exposure. Choosing a shorter route was not always possible, and sudden North Atlantic weather could punish even expert judgment. But deciding when not to sail was every bit as important as knowing how to sail. Ports, beaches, river mouths, and temporary camps offered chances to repair clothing, dry blankets, cook, sleep, and restore the crew. The best defense against a freezing night at sea was sometimes avoiding that night altogether. Different ships also created different conditions. A narrow warship prioritized speed and a large rowing crew, while broader cargo vessels carried heavier loads and offered a different arrangement of space, supplies, and shelter. Not every Viking Age traveler was a raider on the same iconic dragon-headed longship. Merchants, settlers, warriors, craftspeople, enslaved people, and families traveled in vessels chosen for different purposes. A voyage to a nearby coast was not the same challenge as a North Atlantic crossing toward Iceland or Greenland. That is why any single answer to Viking warmth must remain flexible. Clothing, cargo, crew size, route, season, ship type, and luck all change the equation. History becomes less cinematic here, but much more human. Experimental archaeology helps us understand those human limits. When modern crews sail accurate reconstructions such as the Sea Stallion of Glendalough, they test how the hull moves, how watches function, where people can sleep, and how exhausting cold spray becomes. These voyages do not recreate the Viking Age perfectly, because modern crews use safety equipment, modern medical knowledge, and sometimes modern outerwear. They also cannot reproduce the childhood training, expectations, or risk tolerance of a Viking Age sailor. But the experiments reveal constraints that a drawing of a ship cannot show. Wet wool fills storage space, wind reaches almost everywhere, rest happens in awkward positions, and every dry object requires protection. They turn an abstract question about warmth into a practical question about the next 4 hours. That evidence should inform the story without being confused with direct proof of every ancient habit. Where the record is silent, the responsible answer is probability, not certainty. So did Vikings stay warm on freezing ships? Sometimes, but warm is probably the wrong standard. They stayed functional by trapping heat in layers of wool, adding cloaks, hides, blankets, and coverings when available, controlling wind and moisture, eating enough to work, rotating duties, and seeking land before exposure became overwhelming. They accepted discomfort that most modern travelers would consider an emergency, yet they remained vulnerable to storms, exhaustion, cold injury, and death. Their achievement was not immunity to winter. It was a flexible survival system built from textile skill, seamanship, teamwork, and generations of hard-earned experience. The longship carried no furnace, but every layer, every watch, every sheltered landing, and every helpful crewmate preserved a little more heat. That little difference was often enough to reach the next shore. Thank you for watching. If this journey changed the way you picture life on a Viking ship, leave a like and subscribe for more stories about how people survived the past. And the next time your heater feels slightly too low, be grateful your floor is not moving beneath an icy North Atlantic wave.